Donald Trump returned to office promising strength, leverage, and the restoration of American fear factor. Instead, what has emerged is something far more revealing. Not open rebellion from allies, not theatrical denunciations at every podium, but a quieter and in some ways more serious reaction. A steady, disciplined panic among countries that had built their security around the assumption that Washington, whatever its flaws, could still tell friend from foe. When a US president toys with coercing Denmark over Greenland, jokes about Canada as the 51st state, pressures Europe on Ukraine, and then warns NATO of a very bad future unless allies help clean up a crisis of his own making, the question is no longer whether the style is disruptive. The question is whether the disruption has become the policy. And by the end of this analysis, the pattern becomes rather hard to ignore. Trump's foreign policy is not making America feared in a useful way. It is making America unreliable in a way that is causing governments across Europe and Asia to hedge, rearm, and quietly prepare for a world in which the United States itself has become the strategic risk. The first layer is factual, and it is bad enough on its own. Trump explicitly declined to rule out military or economic coercion to gain control of Greenland and the Panama Canal, while his rhetoric on Canada left allied capitals scrambling to decide whether this was performance art, bargaining theatre, or something more deranged. Experts cited by NPR pointed out the obvious problem. NATO allies are accustomed to a predictable American commitment, and unpredictability of this sort does not produce healthy deterrence. It produces discomfort, mistrust, and strategic recalculation. One expert noted that if the United States actually attacked Danish territory, other NATO members would face the grotesque question of whether mutual defense obligations applied against the alliance's leading power. Quite an achievement, really, taking the most successful military alliance in modern history and forcing it into the sort of thought experiment usually reserved for academic seminars and brandy-soaked security conferences. And that is why the panic is quiet. Quiet panic in diplomacy does not look like shouting. It looks like leaders smiling for photographs while their officials begin revising contingency plans. Lawfare's analysis is blunt. Trump's second-term approach relies on coercion as a tool of alliance management, blurring the distinction between allies and adversaries until partnerships begin to resemble a protection racket. CSIS describes today's transatlantic relationship as an uneasy peace, with security increasingly linked to economic concessions, weapons purchases, and political compliance. In other words, the old alliance model, shared values, common threat perception, mutual reliability, is being replaced by something more grubby and more brittle. America is no longer simply asking allies to contribute more. It is hinting that protection now comes with a bill, a loyalty test, and quite possibly a public humiliation ritual. That tends to concentrate the mind in Berlin, Ottawa, Seoul, and Tokyo. Then came the Strait of Hormuz episode, which distilled the whole method into one almost parodic vignette. Reuters reported that Trump warned NATO faced a very bad future if allies did not help reopen the strait after US and Israeli strikes on Iran triggered escalating attacks and effectively shut the waterway through which around a fifth of global oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes. He called on countries including Britain, France, Japan, and South Korea to send warships, minesweepers, and other assets because, in his view, beneficiaries of the route should help police it. There is, of course, a certain brass-necked elegance to starting a fire and then threatening the neighbors if they do not arrive quickly enough with buckets. But for allies, the message was deadly serious. Washington may launch risky operations, then treat support not as consultation among partners, but as tribute owed after the event. That is not alliance leadership. It is strategic extortion dressed up as burden-sharing. The consequences spread well beyond the Middle East. CSIS notes that transatlantic strain now runs through tariffs, Ukraine policy, tech regulation, possible US troop withdrawals, and the administration's open suggestion that America will no longer be Europe's primary guarantor of security. Reuters Breaking Views argues that Trump's tariffs, threats to take over Greenland, and disdain for NATO are turning America into something resembling a rogue nation in the eyes of partners. Asian allies are hardly thrilled either. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan must now ask whether American forces and political attention can be relied upon if Washington is drawn into another Middle Eastern quagmire. European governments, meanwhile, are watching oil prices rise, Russia profit, and NATO solidarity turned into a bargaining chip. The anxiety here is not ideological, it is logistical. It concerns ships, munitions, intelligence, reserves, industrial capacity. Quiet panic is what happens when spreadsheet people start concluding that the superpower is behaving like a volatility index with nuclear weapons. Nowhere is the strategic inversion clearer than Ukraine. Axios reports that in 2025, European military aid to Ukraine surged by 67%, with financial and humanitarian support up 59%, while US aid effectively ground to a halt, and Trump pushed NATO allies to buy American weapons and bankroll Kiev's defense themselves. Europe, in other words, has quietly replaced the United States as the engine of Ukraine's survival. Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski put the matter with admirable sharpness. Europe is spending real money while the US is making money on the war, and that gives Europeans the right to have a voice in the outcome. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz struck a similar note, arguing that Europe has become Ukraine's crucial backer. So the continent Trump intended to bully into dependence is instead moving, awkwardly but unmistakably, towards strategic adulthood. The first shock to Europe was Russia's invasion. The second, as Axios put it, was Trump's return. And here comes the next hook in the story, because the military panic is only half of it. The deeper shift is economic. When allies stop trusting American constancy, they do not simply buy a few more tanks. They start redesigning their exposure to the United States itself. AP reports that trade partners are increasingly cutting deals among themselves to diversify away from a more protectionist America. The EU has accelerated agreements with India and Mercosur. Some European institutions are reducing their use of US digital services such as Zoom and Teams. Central banks and investors are reportedly dumping dollars and buying gold. Maurice Obstfeld told AP that some of these deals had been in train for years, but pressure from Trump made countries more eager to accelerate them. That is the crucial point. Trump's defenders like to describe Allied adjustment as proof of successful pressure. But there is a difference between allies contributing more within an American-led order and allies building escape routes from that order. Brookings scholars take the argument further. They do not see Trump as reshaping the world order with some grand coherent design. They see him disrupting it, accelerating the transition away from a US-led system without any serious plan for what replaces it. One scholar argued that Trump's project is to show that the United States will not be restrained in its use of economic and military power. Another warned that as confidence in US stewardship dissipates, governments and investors hedge, and the world moves faster towards a more contested, less US-centered system than many assume possible. The Atlantic Council's review of Trump's national security strategy reaches an equally awkward conclusion. It calls for strong alliances, but on increasingly transactional terms, underplays the Russian threat in Europe, and frames competition with China more as an interest-based struggle than a defense of any broader free world concept. So the rhetoric still borrows the language of alliance, while the operating system beneath it has been rewritten in the language of deals, grudges, and invoices. There is, of course, a historical comparison available, and it is one Trump's admirers often enjoy invoking: Nixon's so-called madman theory: act unpredictably, appear irrational, make adversaries think anything is possible, and perhaps they blink first. But as the experts quoted by NPR point out, that approach only works, if it works at all, as a tightly controlled tactic. If irrationality becomes the permanent brand, then the effect is not deterrence, but the collapse of credibility. Other states stop believing assurances, stop trusting commitments, and stop building strategy around one's word. This is why Trump's style alarms even when it is dismissed as theater. Theater has consequences when the actors command aircraft carriers. If every negotiation begins with threats against friends, then every friend eventually starts planning for the possibility that the threat is real, or just as dangerous, that the threatening party no longer knows the difference between improvisation and policy. And that leads to one of the more absurd but revealing features of the current moment: the imperial daydreaming. Greenland, Canada, the Panama Canal, the language sounds less like modern statecraft than the fevered after-dinner monologue of a property developer who has mistaken a map for a brochure. Yet the mockery should not obscure the damage. Lawfare notes that this territorial coercion is unprecedented in modern alliance politics and contributes to acute crises within NATO. Threatening a Danish territory while claiming to defend Western civilization is a curious method of coalition management. It is rather like safeguarding a marriage by flirting with the neighbor and charging one's spouse for home security. The Allies, unsurprisingly, are not soothed. They are not required to believe every threat will be carried out. They merely need to conclude that American judgment has become erratic enough to justify hedging against it. And many now plainly have. Asia has reasons of its own to be uneasy. Reuters Breaking Views notes that Japan, South Korea and Taiwan are watching the Middle East distraction with concern, particularly as US assets have been redeployed and as Beijing may conclude that the balance of forces is tilting in its favor. This has a familiar historical shape. China was able to build strength while the United States was tied down in Iraq. A similar pattern could recur if Washington again dissipates strategic attention in a conflict of choice while simultaneously alienating allies whose support would be vital in any larger contest. Trump's defenders speak as though forceful improvisation projects strength everywhere at once. In practice, it often does the opposite. It exposes that power, however immense, is still finite, that allies are multipliers, not decorative extras, and that one cannot spend credibility in Europe, stability in the Gulf, and reassurance in Asia, as though all three were limitless budget lines. Teen Perfull. So what is the underlying pattern? It is not simply that Trump is rude, erratic, or fond of tariffs. The deeper problem is that he appears to view alliances as assets to be exploited rather than relationships to be maintained. Brookings says he is accelerating the move away from a US-led order without offering any viable replacement. Lawfare says he is not merely retreating from the post-war system, but seeking to dismantle it. CSIS sees security and trade now fused into a transactional client-provider model. That is why the panic is quiet but widespread. Allies have stopped asking only, what does Trump want today? They are increasingly asking, what if this is the new normal? And once that question takes hold inside defense ministries, central banks and foreign offices, behavior changes long before public language does. The real rupture begins not with a dramatic summit collapse, but with countless sober decisions taken behind closed doors by people who have concluded that the United States may no longer be dependable. Bringing all this together, the evidence points in one direction. Trump's foreign policy is causing quiet panic because it transforms uncertainty from a temporary negotiating tactic into the central feature of American statecraft. It threatens allies and emboldens adversaries in the same movement. It pushes Europe to finance Ukraine without trusting Washington, nudges trade partners to build alternative blocs, encourages debate about independent deterrence, and invites middle powers to hedge against a less reliable America. The irony is devastating. A president determined to prove that the United States can no longer be taken advantage of may be accelerating the far more consequential process by which the United States can no longer be taken for granted. And if this pattern continues, the implications will not remain subtle for long. Europe will go further in strategic autonomy. Trade and financial diversification away from the United States will deepen. Asian allies will invest more urgently in self-help. Rivals, especially China and Russia, will continue exploiting the widening gap between American power and American reliability. The broader post-war system will not vanish overnight. These things rarely do. It will fray, compartment by compartment, agreement by agreement, assumption by assumption. That is how great orders fail when they are not conquered from outside, but hollowed out from within. Trump's foreign policy does not merely alarm allies because it is abrasive. It alarms them because beneath all the bluster, it keeps producing the same consequence. America looks less like the anchor of the democratic world and more like the largest unpredictable force in it. And for allies who built their security around the opposite assumption, that is not a passing inconvenience. It is the beginning of an era they had hoped never to see.